The morning mist clung to the Snake River like ghostly fingers, and 43-year-old Cowman emerged from his weathered cabin as he had every dawn for the past 7 years. His boots crunched against the frost-covered ground as he made his way toward the water's edge, carrying his fishing gear and the weight of a solitary existence that had become his only companion. Cowman wasn't his real name. Folks in Millbrook had forgotten his given name long ago. Some said it was because he'd once owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. Others whispered it was because he was stubborn as a bull. The truth was simpler and more painful. After losing his wife and unborn child in a fever outbreak, he'd retreated to this isolated stretch of land where only the cattle seemed to understand his grief. The town had branded him a hermit, a broken man who'd let his ranch fall to ruin and his reputation crumble along with it. Whispers followed him on his rare trips to town. Stories of drinking, of debts, of a man who'd given up on life itself. Most were lies, but Cowman had stopped caring about the truth years ago. As he cast his line into the murky water, a sound caught his attention. A soft whimper, barely audible above the river's gentle flow. Cowman froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from the dense thicket of cottonwoods about 50 yards upstream. Setting down his fishing rod, Cowman approached cautiously. What he found among the twisted roots and fallen branches made his heart skip a beat. A boy, no more than 8 years old, huddled against a massive tree trunk. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and mud. But it was his eyes that struck Cowman most, wide with terror, darting frantically at every sound. "Easy there, son," Cowman said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child recoiled, pressing himself harder against the tree. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Cowman noticed the fresh bruises on the boy's arms, the way he favored his left leg, and the unmistakable look of someone who'd been running for his life. "You hungry?" Cowman asked, pulling a piece of jerky from his pocket. The boy's eyes fixed on the food, but he didn't move. "It's all right. Take your time." For nearly an hour, Cowman sat patiently in the dirt, occasionally offering food or water, speaking in gentle tones about the river, the weather, anything that might calm the terrified child. Gradually, the boy's breathing slowed, and he accepted small pieces of jerky and sips from Cowman's canteen. When Cowman finally stood to leave, the boy's eyes filled with panic. Without thinking, Cowman extended his hand. "You can come with me if you want. Got a warm cabin and plenty of food." The boy hesitated for a long moment before placing his small, trembling hand in Cowman's weathered palm. Back at the cabin, Cowman prepared a simple meal while the boy sat at his kitchen table, still silent, but no longer trembling. As they ate, Cowman studied the child's face, trying to piece together his story. The boy was well fed despite his current state, his hair recently cut, his clothes, though torn, of good quality. This wasn't a street orphan or a runaway from poverty. "Can you tell me your name?" Cowman asked gently. The boy opened his mouth but only managed a strangled whisper before shaking his head in frustration. Whether from trauma or injury, speech seemed beyond him for now. "That's all right. We'll figure it out." Cowman cleared the dishes, his mind racing. Someone would be looking for this boy. Parents, relatives, authorities. But the terror in those young eyes suggested that whoever was searching might not have the child's best interests at heart. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the sound of approaching horses reached the cabin. Cowman peered through his window to see 3 riders approaching. Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley and 2 men he didn't recognize, all wearing the stern expressions of official business. The boy heard the horses, too. His face went white, and he scrambled under the kitchen table, curling into a ball. "Stay quiet," Cowman whispered, then stepped outside to meet the men. "Afternoon, Cowman," Deputy Bradley called out, dismounting with practiced ease. "We're looking for a missing boy, about 8 years old, brown hair, last seen near the river. You haven't happened to see anyone matching that description, have you?" Cowman's instincts screamed danger. Bradley's tone was too casual, his companions too eager. "Can't say I have. What's the boy done?" "Nothing," one of the strangers interjected quickly. "He's just confused. Ran away from his guardians. They're worried sick." "Guardians?" Cowman asked. "What happened to his parents?" The men exchanged glances. "Tragic accident," Bradley said. "These gentlemen are his legal guardians now. They just want to get him home safely." Through his window, Cowman caught sight of the boy's face. Pure terror at the sound of the strangers' voices. Whatever these men represented, the child was more afraid of them than he'd been of a complete stranger in the woods. "Well, like I said, haven't seen hide nor hair of any boy," Cowman replied steadily. "But I'll keep an eye out." The strangers weren't satisfied. "Mind if we take a look around?" the taller one asked, already moving toward the cabin. "Actually, I do mind," Cowman said, stepping into their path. "This is private property, and unless you've got a warrant, you can look from right where you're standing." Deputy Bradley's face hardened. "Now, Cowman, there's no need to be difficult. We're just trying to help a lost child. And I'm just trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon on my own land," Cowman replied. "You find that warrant, you're welcome to come back." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, Bradley nodded curtly. "We'll be back," he said, mounting his horse. "And Cowman, if you do happen to see this boy, you'd better do the right thing. Some folks in town are already talking about how a man living alone out here might not be suitable company for a child." The threat hung in the air like smoke as the 3 men rode away. Cowman watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then hurried back inside. The boy was still under the table, but his eyes met Cowman's with a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "Those men," Cowman said quietly. "They're the ones you're running from, aren't they?" The boy nodded vigorously. "Well then," Cowman said, settling into his chair with a determination he hadn't felt in years, "I reckon they're going to have to keep looking." As night fell over the Snake River, Cowman realized his quiet, solitary life was about to become very complicated. But looking at the boy, who'd finally managed to fall asleep on his old sofa, he knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, at least, one frightened child was safe. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." Dawn brought no peace to Cowman's cabin. Before the sun had fully risen above the eastern hills, the sound of multiple horses and wagon wheels announced the arrival of unwelcome visitors. Cowman peered through his window to see nearly a dozen townspeople gathered in his yard, led by Mayor Harrison Blackwood and Deputy Bradley. The boy, who'd been quietly eating breakfast, immediately ducked behind the kitchen counter at the sound of voices outside. "Cowman!" Mayor Blackwood's voice boomed across the yard. "We need to talk." Stepping outside, Cowman faced the assembled crowd. He recognized most of them, shopkeepers, farmers, the banker, even the preacher. Their faces showed a mixture of concern, suspicion, and barely contained anger. "Morning, folks," Cowman said evenly. "Bit early for a social call, isn't it?" "Cut the act, Cowman," snapped Mrs. Abernathy, the town's self-appointed moral guardian. "We know you've got that boy in there. Those poor men searched half the night for their ward." "Ward?" Cowman raised an eyebrow. "Funny. Yesterday they called themselves guardians. Today it's ward. Tomorrow it might be something else entirely." "Mayor," Blackwood stepped forward, his politician smile failing to mask his irritation. "Now see here, Cowman. These gentlemen have proper legal documentation. The boy belongs with them, and you're interfering with lawful custody." "Then let's see this documentation," Cowman replied. "Right here, right now." The mayor's smile faltered. "The papers are being processed through proper channels. In the meantime, you're harboring a runaway, which is a serious offense. Harboring suggests I'm hiding." "Someone," Cowman said. "I told Deputy Bradley yesterday. I haven't seen any boy." "That's a lie." The accusation came from Jake Morrison, the town drunk who'd somehow sobered up enough to join the mob. "My cousin works at the telegraph office. Says those men sent word to the territorial marshal. They're offering a $500 reward for information leading to the boy's return." A murmur rippled through the crowd. $500 was more money than most of these people saw in a year. $500, repeated Mrs. Abernathy, her eyes gleaming. "That's quite a sum for a simple runaway case." Cowman felt the crowd's mood shifting. Suspicion was giving way to greed, and greed made people dangerous. "Think about what you're doing," Cowman said, addressing the group. "You're taking the word of strangers over someone you've known for years." "Known you," scoffed Tom Bradley. "Cowman, you've been a hermit for 7 years. Half the town thinks you've gone soft in the head, living out here alone. And the other half thinks you're hiding something," added the banker, Mr. Cornelius. "A man doesn't just give up a successful ranch and disappear unless he's got secrets." The old wounds opened fresh. Cowman remembered the whispers that had started after Sarah's death, how he'd been drinking, how he'd let the ranch fall apart, how he couldn't handle the responsibility. None of it was true, but truth had never been as powerful as gossip in a small town. "My personal life isn't your concern," Cowman said quietly. "It is when it involves a child," Mrs. Abernathy declared. "What business does a broken-down drunk have with a young boy? It's not natural." The implication hit Cowman like a physical blow. He saw the same suspicion reflected in several faces, the kind of ugly assumption that could destroy a man's life even if proven false. "You'd better watch your tongue, ma'am," Cowman said, his voice dangerously low. "Or what?" Jake Morrison stepped forward, emboldened by the crowd. "You'll do what you did to your wife?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even Mrs. Abernathy looked shocked at Morrison's words. "What did you say?" Cowman's voice was barely a whisper. Morrison, realizing he'd gone too far but unable to back down in front of the crowd, pressed on. "Everyone knows she didn't die of no fever. Convenient how you were the only one who got sick and recovered." The rage that filled Cowman was white-hot and dangerous. For a moment, the crowd saw not a broken hermit, but the man who'd once faced down cattle rustlers and claim jumpers with nothing but iron will and faster hands. "Say that again," Cowman challenged, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip where a gun had once hung. "Enough!" Mayor Blackwood stepped between them. "This isn't helping anyone. Cowman, be reasonable. Even if you don't have the boy, these accusations aren't going away. The territorial marshal is coming. Federal agents might follow. Do you really want that kind of attention? Cowman forced himself to calm down, but his eyes never left Morrison's face. I've got nothing to hide from any marshal. Then prove it, Deputy Bradley said. Let us search the cabin. If the boy's not there, we'll apologize and leave you be. And if I refuse, then we'll assume you've got something to hide, the mayor replied, and this crowd might decide to take matters into their own hands. The threat was clear. Cowman looked at the faces surrounding him. People he'd known for years. Some he'd helped during hard times. Others he'd considered friends. Now they looked at him like a stranger, or worse, like a criminal. You've got 1 hour, Cowman said finally. Then I want you all off my property. 1 hour for what? Mrs. Abernathy demanded. To think about what you're doing. To ask yourselves why strangers offering reward money are more trustworthy than your own neighbor. To wonder why a boy would run away from people who claim to care about him. Cowman turned and walked back toward his cabin, leaving the crowd murmuring behind him. Inside, he found the boy crouched by the window, having witnessed the entire confrontation. They're not going away, are they? Cowman said softly. The boy shook his head, then did something unexpected. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the fireplace and began drawing on the wooden floor. His small hands worked quickly, sketching crude but recognizable figures. A man in a suit, another in a badge, and a third figure that made Cowman's blood run cold. The third figure wore the distinctive collar of a preacher, but the boy had drawn him with horns. The preacher? Cowman whispered. Reverend Matthews is involved in this? The boy nodded frantically, then drew more figures, men with guns, a building that looked like a church, and finally, a scene that made Cowman's stomach turn. Bodies on the ground, including 2 adults who could only be the boy's parents. You saw them killed, Cowman said, understanding flooding through him. That's why you can't speak. That's why you're running. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. Outside, the crowd was growing restless. Cowman could hear more voices, more horses arriving. The 1-hour deadline was meaningless. They weren't leaving without the boy. Listen to me, Cowman said, kneeling beside the child. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? The boy wiped his eyes and nodded with determination that seemed far too old for his young face. Cowman began gathering supplies, food, water, ammunition, and the old rifle he'd hoped never to use again. As he worked, he could hear the crowd outside growing larger and more agitated. Soon, they'd stop asking permission and start taking action. There's a cave about 2 miles upstream, Cowman explained quietly, hidden behind a waterfall. You'll be safe there while I figure out our next move. But as he spoke, the sound of breaking glass came from the front of the cabin. Someone had thrown a rock through his window. Time's up, Cowman, Mayor Blackwood shouted. Send the boy out or we're coming in. Cowman looked at the frightened child beside him and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Not today, he muttered, checking his rifle. Not ever. The siege of Cowman's cabin was about to begin. The standoff lasted 3 days. Cowman had managed to slip away with the boy under cover of darkness on the first night, using an old mining tunnel that connected his root cellar to a ravine 1/2 mile away. They'd taken refuge in the hidden cave behind the waterfall, but Cowman knew it was only a temporary solution. From their concealed position, They watched as the townspeople ransacked his cabin, searching for clues about the boy's whereabouts. What they found instead were the charcoal drawings the child had left behind. Crude but unmistakable depictions of murder and corruption that sent shockwaves through the search party. "This changes everything," Cowman overheard Deputy Bradley telling Mayor Blackwood as they stood by the riverbank. "If the boy really witnessed what these pictures suggest, then we need to find him before anyone else does," the mayor replied grimly. "And we need to ask ourselves some hard questions about who we can trust." But trust was already fracturing. The two mysterious guardians had grown increasingly agitated as the search dragged on, their polite facades cracking to reveal something much darker underneath. When Mrs. Abernathy questioned their authority for the third time, the taller stranger, who called himself Mr. Garrett, made a mistake that would prove costly. "The boy belongs to us," Garrett snapped, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "And anyone who interferes will answer to powers higher than this pathetic town." The threat silenced the crowd, but it also opened eyes. These weren't grieving guardians. They were something else entirely. That evening, as Cowman and the boy shared a meager meal in their cave hideout, they received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the town's physician, appeared at the cave entrance with her medical bag and a grim expression. "I know you're in there," she called softly. "I'm alone and I'm here to help." Cowman emerged cautiously, rifle in hand. Dr. Harper was one of the few people in town he'd always respected, a woman who'd fought prejudice and ignorance to establish her practice, treating everyone regardless of their ability to pay. "How did you find us?" Cowman asked. "I followed the water," she replied simply. "Same way I found you 7 years ago when you were half dead from grief and whiskey. You always did favor high places when you needed to think." She was right. After Sarah's death, Cowman had spent weeks in these hills, wrestling with demons that nearly consumed him. "What do you want, Doc?" "To examine the boy," she said, gesturing toward the cave, "and to tell you what I've learned about your mysterious visitors." Inside the cave, Dr. Harper gently examined the child while Cowman kept watch. Her findings were disturbing. Old injuries that suggested systematic abuse, signs of malnutrition despite the boy's current appearance, and most troubling of all, evidence of deliberate trauma to his throat. "Someone hurt his vocal cords," she explained quietly. "Not permanently, but enough to make speech painful and difficult. This wasn't an accident." The boy watched her with wary eyes, but when she offered him a piece of candy from her bag, he managed a small smile, the first Cowman had seen. "Now," Dr. Harper continued, "about your visitors. I did some checking through my medical contacts in the territorial capital. There's no record of any guardianship papers being filed for a boy matching this child's description. More interesting, there's no record of any recent deaths that would require such arrangements." "So they're lying about everything," Cowman said. "It gets worse. I sent a telegram to a colleague in Denver who works with federal marshals. According to him, there's been a string of mysterious deaths across 3 territories. Families killed, children disappearing, always with the same pattern. Witnesses eliminated, evidence destroyed, and official investigations that go nowhere." Cowman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "You're saying this is bigger than just our town?" "Much bigger. And I think our boy here saw something that threatens some very powerful people." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses echoed from the valley below. Through the cave opening, they could see torches moving through the darkness. A search party, but not the townspeople they'd been dealing with. Federal marshals, Dr. Harper whispered, recognizing the organized formation. They arrived this afternoon with a warrant for your arrest. On what? Charges? Kidnapping, interfering with federal custody, and... She hesitated. Suspicion of murder. Murder? Whose murder? Jake Morrison. They found his body in the river this morning. Shot once through the heart. Cowman's blood ran cold. Morrison had been the most vocal about the reward money, the most willing to believe the worst about Cowman's motives. I didn't kill Morrison, Cowman said firmly. I know, Dr. Harper replied, but someone did, and they want you blamed for it. This is about silencing witnesses. All of them. The boy suddenly grabbed Cowman's arm, pointing frantically toward the cave entrance. In the distance, they could see a figure moving separately from the main search party, someone who knew exactly where to look. Reverend Matthews, Dr. Harper breathed. I should have known. The preacher emerged from the shadows below, no longer wearing his usual benevolent expression. In the torchlight, his face looked hard and calculating as he directed the marshals toward their hiding place. We need to move, Cowman said, gathering their supplies. Now. But as they prepared to flee deeper into the cave system, Dr. Harper made a decision that surprised them both. No, she said firmly. Running won't solve this. That boy needs to tell his story, and we need people to hear it. He can't speak, Cowman reminded her. He can write, and I know someone who can help us get his story to the right people, someone those corrupt marshals can't touch. She pulled a small notebook from her medical bag and handed it to the boy. Can you write your name? The child took the pencil with trembling hands and carefully wrote, Timothy James Morrison. Cowman stared at the name. Morrison? Like Jake Morrison? Dr. Harper's eyes widened with understanding. Jake Morrison's nephew, the boy who supposedly died with his parents in a house fire 3 months ago in Colorado Territory. The pieces were falling into place. Jake Morrison hadn't been killed for the reward money. He'd been killed because he'd recognized his own nephew and was starting to ask questions. Timothy, Dr. Harper said gently, can you write about what happened to your parents? The boy nodded and began to write, his small hand moving carefully across the page. What emerged was a story of corruption that reached from small frontier towns to the territorial capital itself, a network of officials, lawmen, and religious leaders who eliminated anyone who threatened their illegal activities. Timothy's parents had been government surveyors who discovered evidence of massive land fraud. They'd been killed to keep them quiet, their son taken to ensure his silence. But Timothy had escaped, and now he was the only witness who could expose the entire conspiracy. We have to get this information to the territorial governor, Dr. Harper said. He's the only one with enough authority to investigate federal marshals. And how do we do that with half the territory looking for us? Cowman asked. Dr. Harper smiled grimly. We're going to need help from some very unexpected allies. As the search party drew closer to their position, Cowman realized their fight was just beginning. But for the first time since finding Timothy by the river, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the chance for justice. The revelation came at dawn on the 4th day, but not in the way anyone expected. Cowman, Dr. Harper, and Timothy had spent the night in an abandoned mining shack high in the hills, planning their next move. Their hope lay in reaching the territorial capital and getting Timothy's written testimony to Governor Mitchell. But the journey would take them through territory crawling with corrupt marshals and their allies. What they hadn't counted on was the arrival of a genuine federal investigator. Agent Sarah Whitmore of the Treasury Department had been tracking the land fraud conspiracy for 6 months, following a trail of forged documents and murdered witnesses across 3 territories. Her investigation had led her to the same conclusion Dr. Harper had reached, that a network of corrupt officials was systematically eliminating anyone who threatened their illegal operations. She arrived in Millbrook just as the town was tearing itself apart with suspicion and fear. "I'm looking for a man called Cowman," she announced to the assembled crowd in the town square. "And I'm looking for a boy named Timothy Morrison, who's the key witness in a federal investigation." The crowd erupted in confusion. Mayor Blackwood stepped forward, his political instincts sensing danger. "Agent Whitmore, we've been cooperating fully with the federal marshals already here. They have jurisdiction in this matter." "What marshals?" Agent Whitmore asked sharply. "I'm the only federal agent assigned to this case." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Matthews, standing at the edge of the crowd, began to back away slowly. "Stop right there, Reverend," Agent Whitmore called out. "We need to talk." But Matthews was already running, his clerical robes flapping as he sprinted toward the church. Agent Whitmore drew her weapon and gave chase, with half the town following behind. Meanwhile, high in the hills, Cowman heard the commotion echoing from the valley below. Through his spyglass, he could see people running through the streets, but couldn't make out what was happening. "Something's changed," he told Dr. Harper. "The whole town's in an uproar." Timothy, who'd been writing steadily in Dr. Harper's notebook, suddenly looked up and pointed toward the church steeple. Even from their distance, they could see smoke beginning to rise from the building. "He's destroying evidence," Dr. Harper realized. "We need to get down there." The race to the church became a convergence of justice and desperation. Agent Whitmore arrived first, kicking down the door to find Reverend Matthews frantically feeding documents into the church's potbelly stove. "Step away from the fire," she ordered, her gun trained on the corrupt preacher. "You're too late," Matthews snarled, his mask of piety completely dropped. "Everything's burned. You have no proof of anything." But he was wrong. Timothy had been writing for hours, documenting not just what he'd witnessed, but everything he'd overheard during his captivity. The boy had an extraordinary memory for detail, and his testimony would prove devastating to the entire conspiracy. As Agent Whitmore arrested, Matthews, Cowman, and his companions finally emerged from hiding. The reunion in the church was emotional, Timothy running to embrace the man who'd risked everything to protect him, Dr. Harper finally able to treat the boy's injuries properly, and Cowman facing a town that was beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Among the documents Matthews had failed to burn, Agent Whitmore discovered something that changed everything. A letter detailing the conspiracy's next target. The Morrison family hadn't been their first victims, and Timothy wasn't meant to be their last. The conspiracy had been planning to eliminate Dr. Harper next, recognizing her as a threat to their operations. Her medical practice gave her access to information about suspicious deaths, and her integrity made her impossible to corrupt or intimidate. "They were going to kill you," Cowman told her as they read the letter together. "Make it look like an accident, then blame me for that too." But why frame you specifically? Agent Whitmore asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy, who'd been listening from the church doorway, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Because we made it easy for them, she said quietly. All those years of gossip and suspicion, all those lies about his drinking and his wife's death, we turned him into the perfect scapegoat. The truth about Sarah's death finally came out. She died of fever, just as the doctor had said, but the conspiracy had spread rumors suggesting otherwise. They'd been planning to use Cowman as a fall guy for years, knowing the town's prejudices would make him an easy target. I'm sorry, Mrs. Abernathy said, addressing Cowman directly. We all are. We let strangers turn us against our own neighbor. The apologies came in waves after that, from the mayor, from the shopkeepers, from everyone who'd been so quick to believe the worst. But it was Timothy's reaction that mattered most to Cowman. The boy, finally feeling safe enough to try speaking, managed to whisper his first words in months. Thank you. The conspiracy's collapse was swift and complete. Agent Whitmore's investigation, combined with Timothy's testimony, led to arrests across 3 territories. The fake marshals were revealed to be hired killers. The land fraud scheme was exposed, and dozens of corrupt officials found themselves facing federal charges. Timothy was reunited with his surviving relatives, an aunt and uncle in California who'd been searching for him since his parents' death. But before he left Millbrook, he had one final gift for the man who'd saved his life. Using his remarkable artistic ability, Timothy drew a portrait of Cowman, not as the broken hermit the town had imagined, but as the hero he truly was. Below the drawing, in careful handwriting, he wrote, "To the bravest man I know." The town of Millbrook learned valuable lessons about trust, prejudice, and the danger of believing convenient lies over inconvenient truths. They also learned about redemption, how one man's courage in the face of overwhelming opposition could expose corruption and save lives. Cowman's reputation was not just restored, but elevated. Offers poured in from neighboring towns seeking his help with their own problems. The territorial governor personally thanked him for his service to justice, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harper, who'd been considering leaving Millbrook due to the prejudice she faced as a female physician, decided to stay. She and Cowman began working together, using their combined skills to help people throughout the territory. You know, she said one evening as they sat by the Snake River watching the sunset, this town could use a sheriff who actually cares about justice. Cowman smiled, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose and belonging. Think they'd trust a former hermit with a badge? I think they'd trust the man who risked everything to protect a child, she replied. 6 months later, Sheriff Cowman was sworn in by the same mayor who'd once threatened him. Timothy, now living safely with his relatives, sent regular letters describing his new life and his plans to become a lawman himself someday. The conspiracy that had terrorized 3 territories was broken, its leaders facing justice and its victims finally at peace. But more than that, a community had learned to look beyond surface appearances and gossip to see the true character of those around them. As Cowman pinned on his sheriff's badge for the first time, he thought about the morning he'd found a frightened boy by the river. He'd expected to save one child's life, but in the end, that child had saved his soul. The Snake River continued to flow past Millbrook, carrying away the old secrets and prejudices, leaving behind a town ready to face the future with wisdom earned through trial and redemption. And in his office, Sheriff Cowman kept Timothy's portrait on his desk, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage comes from simply refusing to give up on what's right. The lonely cowman had found his purpose, the town had found its conscience, and justice had prevailed in the end, just as it should in any story worth telling. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.